Brace yourself for the terror I'm about to share with you. I'm not even sure if this is the right place to tell a story like this, but at this point, I feel this weird compulsion to get it out there. I've talked about it to my family, neighbors, even strangers on the street, and it never feels enough. I need to share this, even if it's just to let people know what's been happening. I'll start at the beginning, even though the memories still haunt me like it was yesterday. It all started in 2013, when I was in my late 20s, newly married, and living in a small but charming house at the edge of Pine Brook, a remote town nestled between dense forests. I was a tech consultant with a flexible schedule, so my wife and I decided to buy a fixer-upper on the outskirts of town. We thought it would be peaceful and quiet. The house had history, a lot of it actually, and the idea of starting a family there was comforting. It was a weathered two-story home that had once been a vacation cabin for a wealthy family back in the 50s. The original owners had passed it down through generations, and eventually, it found its way into my hands after an auction. Pine Brook was beautiful, if you liked isolation. A sleepy town with just a few hundred residents, and the nearest store was a good 15-minute drive away. There were wooded trails everywhere, and the wilderness felt alive with the buzz of creatures and rustling trees. Our house sat at the edge of Pine Brook's town limits, which meant the forest was our backyard. I wasn't bothered by the isolation at first. It was part of the charm. We were living the dream, close enough to nature, far enough from the chaos of city life. At first, everything felt perfect, but then things started happening. It was a cold November morning in 2015. A light snow had covered the ground overnight, making the world outside look like something out of a postcard. I was enjoying my coffee, sitting at the kitchen table, when I noticed something odd through the window. Footprints, in the snow. Not just a few, but an entire trail leading from the edge of the woods to my back porch. I blinked, rubbed my eyes, and then stared again. They were unmistakable. Footprints in the snow, fresh, not something that had been there all night, and they led right up to our back door. My wife, Maria, was still asleep, so I decided to check it out on my own. My heart was beating a little faster than usual, but I didn't want to jump to conclusions. I stepped outside, crunching through the snow, my breath misting in the cold morning air. The prints were unmistakably human, but there was no way anyone would just walk up to our house like that. And the strangest thing, they didn't lead away from the house. They stopped right at the back door and turned around, walking back into the woods. I didn't mention it to Maria at first. I didn't want to scare her, and honestly, I didn't know what to think. I had hoped it was a one-off, some stray animal or neighbor playing a prank. But it nagged at me. The next day, it happened again. More footprints. This time, they were in the front yard, coming from the woods and ending right near the driveway, as though someone had been standing there, just watching. They didn't lead anywhere else. No other signs, no other disturbances. It was like whoever it was had just appeared and then vanished. I kept this to myself, not wanting to worry Maria, but the unease settled deep in my bones. I felt like I was being watched. Over the next few weeks, the weird occurrences escalated. More footprints, more strange disturbances around the house. Sometimes I would wake up in the middle of the night to strange noises, a scratching at the windows, faint tapping against the walls. But when I went outside to check, there was nothing. I tried telling myself it was the wind, the house settling, but I knew deep down that wasn't true. Then came the worst part. One winter evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Maria was sitting on the couch in the living room while I was in the kitchen making dinner. She looked out the window, and I heard her gasp. "Tony," she said, her voice shaking. "There's someone outside." I rushed over to the window, my heart hammering in my chest. I saw nothing. The yard was empty, blanketed in snow. But then I looked closer. Near the farthest edge of the woods, there was a figure. A person, standing perfectly still in the trees. It was hard to make out their features, but I could tell they weren't moving. My first instinct was to call the police. But then I thought better of it. Who would believe that someone was out there, just standing in the woods? It would be a waste of time. I grabbed my flashlight and my hunting rifle and went outside, telling Maria to stay inside, lock the doors, and call me if anything seemed off. I walked to the tree line, scanning the area with the beam of my flashlight. The figure was gone, just like that. No sound, no movement. But my gut told me I wasn't alone out there. I didn't find anyone that night, and I still don't know what I saw. But that wasn't the end of it. It only got worse. The following months passed, and I did my best to keep things normal. But the fear was always there, lurking in the background. Footprints, more unexplained sounds at night. It became impossible to ignore. In the winter of 2016, after Christmas, something happened that changed everything. I woke up one morning to a scene that made my blood run cold. The entire property was covered in fresh footprints. Dozens of them. They were everywhere. Around the house, around the shed, around the tool shed, which had been left unlocked the previous night. And something was missing. My gun, some tools, a few things from the shed. My heart sank. Someone had been in our yard. Someone had been watching us. I knew I couldn't handle this on my own anymore. I called my old friend Jack, a former military man who lived nearby. He was a no-nonsense guy and had a lot of experience with tracking. He came over the next day and we decided to investigate the woods together. We packed supplies, grabbed our rifles, and ventured into the forest. The footprints were fresh, leading deeper into the trees, so we followed them. The deeper we went, the stranger the situation became. The footprints were erratic, constantly turning back on themselves as if whoever made them was trying to confuse us. It didn't make sense. We should have been able to follow a clear trail, but there were so many dead ends, so many places where the tracks stopped for no reason. Every time we thought we were getting closer, the trail split again. After hours of searching, we reached a clearing, and that's when it happened. In the center of the clearing, there were figures, people. They were standing there, almost blending into the trees. At first I thought they were just shadows, but as my eyes adjusted, I saw them more clearly. They were tall, emaciated, and naked. Their skin was pale, almost gray. There were 4 of them, standing completely still. The air was heavy, and the hairs on the back of my neck stood up. They didn't make a sound. They didn't move. We backed away slowly, not daring to make a noise, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were aware of us, watching, waiting. We stayed hidden in the woods for what felt like hours, barely breathing, hoping they wouldn't notice us. By the time we finally decided to leave, we were terrified. We hadn't gotten a good look at their faces, but the sight of them had been enough to freeze us to the core. We went back to the house, and I made Jack promise not to tell anyone what we saw. I didn't want to believe it myself, but whatever was out there, it wasn't human. I couldn't explain it. The next morning I called the police. They came out to search the area, but of course, they found nothing. No footprints, no evidence. It was like everything had vanished. They said there wasn't much they could do. A few missing tools didn't justify a full-scale investigation, and the woods were too vast to comb through completely. Maria was devastated, terrified that we were being targeted. We made plans to leave Pine Brook, but somehow, every time we tried to pack up, something would happen to delay us. Something always kept us here. Even now, as I write this, I can't help but feel like they're still out there, watching, waiting. The house is still here, but the air feels different now, more oppressive. The footsteps have stopped, for now. But I'm not sure how much longer we can stay. I don't know what they want. I don't know if we'll ever be safe. But I'll never forget the figures in the woods, and I'll never stop wondering if they're still out there. I live in a rural area surrounded by thick forest land, with only a handful of scattered houses nearby. The main road is about 5 minutes away, and the nearest town is 10 minutes beyond that. Across from my home, there's a dense forest that takes about 10 minutes to reach on foot, a place I often explore with my partner. It was the first evening of Christmas, and after stuffing ourselves with holiday food, my partner and I decided to take a walk to help digest. By then, it was already past 5 p.m., and the sky was a deep, featureless black. We brought a powerful LED flashlight, knowing the trails would be difficult to navigate in the dark. I also carried my camera and flash, as I loved capturing eerie shots of the forest at night. We took a familiar path, a narrow dirt trail that wound through the trees. It was mostly used by hikers and led deeper into the woods, eventually connecting to a larger gravel pathway that ran between our village and the next one. That path was only about a 15-minute walk, but there was one part that always felt unsettling, a short stretch where the trees pressed in tightly on either side, forming a tunnel of darkness. Even in daylight, it had an eerie atmosphere. At night, It felt like stepping into something forbidden. As we neared that section, my flashlight beam caught something reflective in the distance. A car. It was parked just off the gravel path, half hidden by the trees. My stomach tightened. Cars weren't supposed to be out here. The path was too narrow and not meant for vehicles. My partner instinctively pointed the flashlight at the car's windows. They were coated in frost, as if the vehicle had been sitting there for quite some time. There was no visible movement inside. No lights on, no sign of anyone nearby. Maybe someone abandoned it? My partner suggested, though their voice carried unease. I nodded, but felt far from convinced. Still, we walked past it, trying not to let it bother us. A few minutes later, I noticed a peculiar tree formation, gnarled branches twisting together in an almost unnatural way. I asked my partner to hold the flashlight steady while I adjusted my camera settings. Just as I raised my camera to take a shot, my partner tensed beside me. Someone is standing behind us. I froze. Slowly, I turned my head, my breath catching in my throat. There, just at the edge of the flashlight's reach, stood a man. He was motionless, facing us. I hadn't heard footsteps. I hadn't seen movement. It was as if he had just appeared there. My pulse pounded in my ears. My partner shifted slightly, gripping the flashlight tighter. "Do you need something?" I asked, forcing my voice to sound calm. The man didn't respond. He just stood there, his silhouette barely illuminated. My first thought was that maybe he owned the car and was startled by us taking photos nearby. But then, why not say anything? And how had he managed to get behind us without making a sound? "Are you lost?" my partner asked, raising the light slightly. Finally, the man spoke, but his voice was low and flat. "No." The single word sent a chill down my spine. We stood there for a few seconds, neither party moving. Then, without another word, we turned and continued walking toward the next village, our pace just slightly faster than before. I didn't dare look back until we reached the first street lamp at the village's entrance. When I finally turned around, my stomach dropped. The car had moved. It had crept forward out of the trees, turned slightly, and then backed into the forest again. The headlights remained off, and the silhouette of the man was nowhere to be seen. "We're not going back that way," my partner said immediately. I nodded in agreement. Instead, we took a much longer route home, circling to avoid the woods entirely. As we walked, our flashlight began to flicker, and my phone battery was dangerously low. The further we got from the village lights, the more the shadows stretched around us, swallowing the path ahead. Every rustling leaf and every crack of a branch made my heart hammer. I kept glancing over my shoulder, expecting to see that unmoving silhouette lurking just beyond the tree line. Then we heard it, a slow, deliberate crunch of footsteps on the trail behind us. We both froze. My partner's grip tightened around my wrist. The sound stopped as soon as we did. The silence was suffocating. Then, another step. It wasn't an animal. The sound was too deliberate, too heavy. Someone was following us. I yanked my partner forward, breaking into a hurried walk. My breath felt sharp in my chest as we quickened our pace. The flashlight flickered again, then cut out completely. Darkness swallowed us whole. My partner fumbled for their phone, trying to turn on its flashlight, but the screen stayed black. Dead battery. Behind us, the footsteps started again, faster this time. We broke into a run. Branches clawed at my arms as we tore through the trees, the village still too far away. I could hear my partner breathing hard beside me, both of us too afraid to look back. I didn't know how close he was. I didn't want to know. Then, silence. We reached the outskirts of our village and burst onto the main road. The streetlights bathed us in cold, artificial safety. I finally turned around, gasping for breath. There was nothing. No figure, no footsteps, just the endless black of the forest behind us. But I knew he was still there, watching. We didn't stop until we reached our house. The first thing I did was call the police and report what we had seen. I regretted not memorizing the entire license plate, only the first few letters. At that moment, I had been too startled to think clearly. Looking back, the whole situation felt impossible. The frozen windows suggested the car had been parked for a long time, yet somehow the man had followed us unnoticed. He had no flashlight, no visible phone, no reason to be lurking in the dark. And the way he had just stood there, watching, silent, waiting. I still don't know what his intentions were. And honestly, I don't want to know what might have happened if I had been alone. Last summer, I decided to take on a long road trip, something I'd always wanted to do. I've always been the type of person who enjoys exploring new places, especially on my own, so the idea of driving across remote stretches of highway with the hum of my car and nothing but the open road ahead felt like the perfect challenge. I had a rough plan in mind: drive for about a week, stopping off in small towns along the way to explore and camp out overnight. The first few days of the trip went smoothly. The roads were empty, the weather was perfect, and I was completely at ease. The vast, open landscapes of the American Southwest stretched out in front of me. Dirt roads, cliffs, endless desert, and nothing but the sound of wind in my ears. I was in good shape, but that didn't mean I was going to drive through the night. Each evening, I would pull over at a rest stop or an isolated patch of roadside to set up camp for the night. I've always been a fan of solitude, so I didn't mind staying off the beaten path. The last thing I wanted was for someone to notice me or interrupt my peace. So each night, I would drive a bit off the road to set up my tent and enjoy the stars above. Everything was fine until the fourth night. I woke up in the middle of the night, my senses suddenly alert to something being wrong. It wasn't a sound or anything tangible, just this gnawing feeling deep in my gut. You know that feeling when you're sure something's out of place but can't put your finger on it? That's what I had. I looked around my tent, but everything seemed fine. The night was still, the stars bright, and the desert air cold. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling, so I grabbed my flashlight and stepped outside. I scanned the surroundings carefully, but everything appeared to be just as it should be. I turned back to my tent, figuring I was just being paranoid, but when I unzipped the door, my stomach dropped. My wallet, gone. At first I thought I'd left it outside, or maybe buried it under my gear, but after checking everything it was clear. Someone had taken it. I couldn't believe it. I was out in the middle of nowhere, miles away from the nearest town, and someone had gotten to me. I still wasn't sure how. They'd have to have snuck into my tent while I was sleeping, but that seemed so unlikely. I convinced myself it was probably just a mistake on my part. Maybe I misplaced it. But over the next few days, the feeling only got worse. Small things started to go missing. My lighter, my pocket knife, a few energy bars, each item seemingly random but undeniably gone. That's when I realized someone was out there with me, taking things, watching me. It was a bizarre feeling, especially since there was no cell service in the area. I couldn't call for help. I thought about turning back, but at this point, I was already so deep into the trip that retracing my steps would only be a minor relief. I had no choice but to keep going, but my sense of unease kept growing. Each night, I'd make sure to lock my tent and keep a weapon nearby, just in case. But then one night, the person, or whatever it was, began to make their presence known. I heard footsteps around my camp, slow and deliberate. I froze in terror. Whoever it was had no intention of being quiet. I grabbed my flashlight and rifle, heart pounding, but I could barely move. The footsteps circled my tent, then stopped. The air was thick with tension, and I had no idea what to do. Should I confront them? Should I hide? My mind raced with 1,000 thoughts, but nothing seemed to make sense. Eventually, the footsteps faded, but I knew I couldn't sleep after that. I couldn't stay another night out there. As the sun rose, I packed up my gear, my hands trembling. The paranoia had settled deep inside me, and I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. I decided I wouldn't stop until I was safely off the road. I didn't care if it meant driving all night. I had to get out. So I kept going, the darkness creeping in faster than I expected. By the time the sun set, I was still pushing forward, my body aching, my mind exhausted from the constant vigilance. I was only a few hours away from the nearest town, but as the last slivers of daylight disappeared, I started to hear it. Footsteps. I whipped my head around, shining my flashlight behind me. My heart nearly stopped. A figure stood just off the side of the road, cloaked in darkness. It was impossible to make out their features, but their presence was undeniable. The figure didn't move at first. They just stood there watching me. I called out, demanding they show themselves, but the figure didn't respond. My grip tightened on the rifle, and before I knew it, I fired a warning shot into the air. The sound of the shot echoed through the emptiness, and the figure immediately darted back into the shadows, disappearing without a trace. My mind was racing as I turned around, ready to run, ready to leave it all behind. I couldn't take it anymore. I bolted from my car, jumped in, and locked the doors. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town. When the police arrived, they didn't ask too many questions. They advised me to leave the area immediately, which was more than enough for me. I didn't need to be told twice. That night, I found a motel and locked myself in. I didn't sleep for hours. The strangest part of the whole experience wasn't the figure. It wasn't the fact that I felt like I was being hunted. It was the hallucinations. I still don't understand how I could have been so deeply affected by the isolation and stress that my mind began to play tricks on me. The puddle that wasn't there, the shadowy figures that flickered in the corners of my eyes, it all felt so real. Now I'm taking a long break from road trips and camping. The experience still haunts me, and I doubt I'll ever venture back into those isolated stretches of highway again. If you're planning a solo trip, especially through areas with no cell service, I'd advise you to take caution. You never know who or what might be out there.